Welcome back to EU Democracy Explained. In the last 3 episodes, we've learned about how the European Commission, the Council of the European Union, and the European Parliament work in the institutional triangle to produce legislation. We also touched on key concepts like representation, accountability, and some of the different theories of European integration. In doing so, we discovered that the EU is a unique system, including 27 different national perspectives working according to a principle of dual legitimacy. In this episode, we're going to delve deeper, looking at how national politicians, in addition to their role in the legislative process via the Council, can help steer the overall direction of the Union. To do this, we need to focus on an EU institution that's not actually part of the legislative process. This is the place where the heads of state or government meet to discuss pressing issues, to react to crises, and to set the European agenda, the European Council. First things first. Over the last 70 years or so, all of the treaties that have developed the European project into what it is today have been negotiated, agreed, and signed by national leaders, and they've been ratified by national parliaments. Now, academics still argue over different theories of why and how European integration happens, and each does have its merit, but at the end of the day, nothing much would happen without the consent of the national level. And this is the first thing you need to understand about the European Council's place in the modern EU. The role of national leaders has been, and continues to be, crucial. So, next time you hear Eurosceptics complaining about Brussels bureaucrats imposing their laws on us, bear in mind the extent to which major decisions over the years have remained in the hands of national leaders. Throughout the 1960s, informal summits developed at a time in which the world was in turmoil. There was global financial instability, the Cold War was at its peak, and energy shocks were a significant destabilizing force. It quickly became clear that the leaders needed to meet regularly and discuss these issues of common concern. At one such summit in Paris in 1974, they decided to formalise these meetings and meet more regularly. This means that the European Council is unique among all the other EU institutions. It created itself and did so out of necessity. And, over the years, the European Council, or EUCO for short, made key decisions in the history of European integration. It was the Milan European Council of 1985 that initiated an intergovernmental conference, eventually leading to the Single European Act. In 1993 in Copenhagen, the European Council decided on a set of criteria that would need to be fulfilled by any country wishing to become a member of the Union. And the Special European Council in Brussels in 1998 was a key moment in the creation of the euro. There are many more examples in the history of the European project. So, let's meet the key players. Who are the members of the EUCO? The European Council is one of the most visible EU institutions, on the basis largely of who its members are and what they discuss during its meetings. Those meetings, which take place at least 4 times a year, always draw the headlines in the European and national press. You've probably seen your President, Prime Minister or Chancellor travel to Brussels or some other European city for either a regular or special summit of the European Council. So what is it about the EUCO that requires the presence of national leaders? Well, its main role is to determine the overall political direction and priorities of the EU. It identifies issues of common concern, outlines what actions should be taken to address them by giving tasks to the other institutions, and defines certain goals along the way. In other words, it sets the EU's agenda. But that's not all. The EUCO also nominates or appoints candidates for the top jobs, such as President of the Commission, which is a nomination that requires approval from the European Parliament, or the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, which is an appointment made in agreement with the Commission President. There are other key aspects, like the so-called strategic agenda that we'll return to later. And finally, the EUCO steps up to react to crises and make difficult decisions in areas that are too sensitive to be addressed elsewhere in the system. It's all about the need to take responsibility at the highest level. As an example, consider matters of external relations that have a complex geopolitical or strategic implication. At a national level, these are the kinds of decisions that have to be taken by the highest levels of government. Well, in the EU you have 27 members, so naturally, with an issue of common concern, the 27 leaders need to come together and take these decisions as a group. The same can be said of crisis response. Just like at the national level, where it would be incumbent on the Prime Minister, the President, and so on to react, at the EU level, it's down to all 27 together. Ultimately, the UCO is the forum for European leaders to discuss difficult topics, set the agenda, and react to crises. In a sense, it's the manifestation of the control each of the 27 national governments has over the common agenda. If you think about it, not much can happen in the EU system if the leaders in the UCO don't want it to happen. But it's not only the 27 heads of state or government who take part. There are 2 more members we've yet to meet, and a number of other figures who can make their voices heard. The current iteration of the European project operates according to what's set out in the Lisbon Treaty. It came into effect in 2009 and made a number of changes, including to the European Council. One of those changes was to create the position of European Council President, elected by the heads of state or government to a once renewable 2.5-year term. Prior to this, the presidency rotated between the member states, as it still does in the Council. The introduction of a permanent office of president means that the meeting chair stays in the system, ensuring that conclusions are followed up on and giving the UCO visibility in between meetings. As part of this, they also meet regularly with each of the leaders to consult closely with them and make sure the institution's work is continued in the months between each meeting. The President also prepares the next UCO meeting, a process we'll come back to later. Since the Single European Act of 1986, the President of the Commission is formally also a member of the UCO, after having participated as a non-member in the early years. This means that when the agenda is being set, the institution that holds the right of legislative initiative is present in the room and can advise on how best to go about implementing the leader's vision. In this capacity, successive Commission presidents have, for instance, advised the leaders on what legislative solutions might be feasible given the competencies granted to the EU by the treaty, and conversely on what might require a different solution. Non-members can also make their voices heard. Before each meeting, the President of the European Parliament is invited to outline that institution's view on the topics under discussion. The High Representative also takes part in the UCO's work, despite not being a member. And in addition, the Presidents of the European Central Bank and the Eurogroup can be invited to attend discussions on economic and financial affairs. Beyond this, the UCO can also invite guests who are not part of the EU system. The Secretaries General of NATO or the UN, for instance, and recently the President of Ukraine, a candidate country, have all been invited as guests to parts of the proceedings. So, we know who takes part and what they do. Now let's look at how they do it. The European Council generally operates according to consensus. This means that decisions are adopted only if no member opposes the motion. Rather than holding a formal vote yea or nay, the members are simply given the opportunity to object. This, along with the understanding that the details of each discussion remain private among the members, serves to create a collegiate atmosphere oriented around problem solving, where no one is afraid to speak their mind. Now, your immediate reaction might be to ask why this is the case. Well, part of it is practical. A European Council summit usually takes place over 2 days and needs to cover a lot of ground, so the leaders need to work efficiently. Working according to consensus means that in areas where there is disagreement, the discussions can focus directly on the issues of most pressing concern for each objecting member, and negotiations can start from there until every side is satisfied. The other part is more structural. First, the meetings are pre-prepared by the President, who consults closely with the Commission President and each of the leaders between meetings. Part of this preparation is the drafting and revision of the European Council conclusions that's done with the Committee of Permanent Representatives, staffed by representatives from each member state, and the General Affairs Council configuration, the monthly meeting of the 27 European Affairs Ministers. Second, obviously, the leaders themselves meet each other bilaterally between the meetings. In other words, there's plenty of room to consider the issues under discussion in between the major summits, so no one arrives unprepared, and by the time the leaders gather in one room, the areas where decisions are needed are normally only those that are most pressing and most difficult. In cases where agreement can't be reached, naturally, the discussion carries on. This means that there's a real feeling of ownership over any eventual agreement by consensus. But the risk of non-agreement is also a source of criticism against consensus as a working practice. Where there is no agreement, it can risk gridlock or serve to water down any eventual decision. If there is a legal need to take a vote, then the system functions like the one we discussed for the Council of the European Union in Episode 2. Unanimity, qualified majority, and simple majority are the three options, and which should be used is defined by the treaty. For example, when electing its own president, nominating a candidate for president of the Commission, or appointing the High Representative in agreement with the Commission President, the decision is made by qualified majority. The voting systems are another area where some people criticise the system. For instance, in a difficult geopolitical landscape, the fact that measures within the common foreign and security policy require unanimity has led some to question exactly how geopolitical an actor the EU can be with its current decision-making setup. And there's an ongoing debate about whether extending the use of qualified majority voting could be a way forward. The argument in favour is that this would make it easier to take decisions, since there would be a lower threshold of agreement. The argument against is that it would risk jeopardising the UKO as a club of equals, leading to more polarisation between the leaders and difficulties further down the line. In any case, there's also a fundamental legal question about how such a change might be made. After all, extending QMV would itself have to be a decision taken by unanimity, so the conversation is ongoing. So here we see again the real control that national leaders have over the Union. The nationally elected heads of state or government discuss as a club and decide either by consensus once everyone is satisfied or by one of three voting methods as applicable. The impetus truly comes from the leaders in all areas. Now let's finish by looking at the outputs the UKO produces to communicate its decisions. At the close of each meeting, the European Council produces conclusions that set out its agreed view and decision in a number of areas. Naturally, as a forum between 27 member states, the language of the European Council conclusions is always very carefully drafted. The conclusions are agreed by consensus during each meeting and published at the end. They can vary in length, and their language can be quite difficult to understand to anyone but the closest observers. But the main takeaway is that they are the primary day-to-day tool that the UKO uses to fulfil its role of setting the agenda. But every 5 years, the European Council produces a much more ambitious document, the Strategic Agenda. In the context of European elections and ahead of the appointment of the new Commission, each strategic agenda lays the groundwork for EU action in the subsequent legislative term, serving as a plan to guide the Union through whatever situation may unfold. So let's conclude by looking at the European Council conclusions of June 2024, which is when the current strategic agenda was adopted. They showcase a little bit of everything we've been discussing. In these conclusions, the UKO first goes through its usual role of addressing issues of common concern and communicating the leaders' agreements. First, matters of complex geopolitical significance and crises are at the forefront, so we see firsthand the role of the UKO in trying to deal with the most difficult issues facing Europe. Second, the conclusions show us the UKO's role in tasking other institutions. Third, we see the UKO's role in making appointments to the top jobs. The UKO's decision on who to elect or nominate to the positions of its own President, Commission President and High Representative all figure in the conclusions. Finally, they adopt the strategic agenda for 2024 to 2029, giving guidance to the Union in the coming years. And there's actually much more than that in the most recent conclusions, as there always is. These are important documents after all, reflecting the status of the institution that produces them. The June 2024 conclusions also include a roadmap on future internal reforms to the EU, recalling the role of national impetus in the development of the European project over the years. As far as the European Council itself is concerned, it's perhaps most revealing to look at the introduction to the new strategic agenda. It briefly lays out some of the EU's achievements in recent years, and each one is framed as something the Union has achieved together. From the early days of informal summits in the 1960s to today's club of leaders, the importance of working together is at the heart of the European Council's role. I I hope you enjoyed that episode of EU Democracy Explained. If you did, be sure to like, comment and subscribe for more from TEPSA. And if you want to learn more about the history of the UCO, be sure to check out this episode of EU History Explained. And if you want to learn how to read and understand the European Council conclusions, check out this episode of Europe Chats. Stay tuned.